Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the SoCal Security Innovation Summit. Today, in my session, in the next 25 to 30 minutes, I will be discussing how do we practically manage supply risks. I have been in this space uh, for the last almost like 23 plus years, and we know many of us follow best frameworks like ISO 31000 or COPIT or any other supplier related risk management framework. But what I've learned with time that even though we are following the best practices, there are certain items, there are certain things which we need to understand or which we need to consider. So what I have done in this session today, based on my past experience, based on my research, based on my study of uh, numerous frameworks, I have put down some key points or some items which we should be considering before we engage a supplier or even if we are working with a certain critical supplier in our organization. It is just like a checklist and it's more like based on my experience and the diary which I maintain. It's like lessons learned kind of a thing today. So let's go on and so moving to my next slide, we will first focus on the areas which I'll cover today. So the areas which I'm planning to cover today, I will be covering today is like related to operational area. We'll go through some items at which items to consider when in terms of operational. Then we'll speak about commercial, some to do with information security and resilience, and then anti-bribery and anti-corruption, fraud, labor practice, health and safety, environmental issues or environmental practice, and then the last but not the least, trade controls. Let's move to the next slide where we talk about operational risk. So what's first of all what I've done in this slide, you can see I've even put down the risk for you. So the operational risk is a supplier's failure to meet contractual milestone or service level agreements, right? So what consideration we should do? First of all, what I've learned from the past that a simple question we should ask yourself, right? Is the supplier strategically important? Right? It indicates how strategy and the critical supplier. So that's the risk which will help us. If it is important, then we need to consider what risks are around it, which I'm sure when you're following a best practice or framework, which you are considering. Okay. What is more important to consider, which has really helped me in life, that is there any evidence that a supplier has not met expectations in prior contracts? Because we know that past performance is a good indicator of the current and the future performance of the supplier. Then the next question which I normally ask myself is the supplier certified with ISO 9001 or any other continuous improvement program or any other best practices standard, right? So because we all know that once if it is assured by ISO 9001, then we could be certain that this supplier is doing well and we can rely on that supplier. And the last point is that has the supplier failed to meet contractual obligations in the last 2 years with other clients? So we can identify, or maybe we can request supplier any kind of a performance report, or maybe there's a publicly available performance report of any supplier, which could help us to understand that what has happened or anything as significant which has happened in the last 2 years with the supplier, right? So what happens in the real world that there's an we should consider that before engaging the supplier from the operational perspective, or at least in this area of risk, right? We should ask for the referees and everything. And the best thing which I can suggest that if case you're engaging a new supplier, it's better to start with a shorter engagement, like 6 to 12 months, or probably 12 months, and then probably set up KPIs against the performance should be managed. So there should be a proper setup of measuring KPIs. First of all, the KPI should be mentioned in the contract and then should be properly reviewed on a periodic basis, right? Now let's go to the second area, which is commercial. So in this, the risk is risk to organization due to restrictive contractual terms, a supplier's financial position, or reciprocal arrangement with a supplier. So let's go through these points. So first of all, we need to understand is your supplier is an existing supplier, and plus is the supplier is your customer, right? If the supplier is your customer, then we need to understand that this could create some challenges if you are trying to change a supplier, because that would also impact your financial earnings. So this is something we need to understand. Then another consideration to understand that if the supplier have any restricted terms, if, for example, if the supplier is really stringent or maybe they are not adopting to your requirements, then there will be the likelihood of the breach of the contract could increase, which could also result in financial penalty or legal action, right? Then the third point to consider is your organization a sole customer of the supplier, right? Or if it is more than 80% of the supplier's revenue. So again, that's something to consider, because if that's the one, so if the supplier is dependent on your organization, right, it will be difficult for us to move away with the arrangement and vice versa, right? And the last point I always mention this, that does the supplier have a history of changes in ownership over the last several years? So again, if the ownership has changed or the management team of the supplier has changed, and if it is changing very frequently, that's an indicator that there is a challenge in the operational stability of the supplier's financial status. So these are like some of the considerations which I've learned in my experience must be considered before engaging supplier. The rest, obviously, you can always follow the framework or your contractual obligations or as per the standard requirements, right? So that is another area. Now let's go to the third area, which is information security. So the risk over here that suppliers' failure to maintain adequate information security controls, which could result in either legal or regulatory penalties. So first consideration I always put in place is what type of information is collected, stored, or transmitted or shared by the supplier. Does the supplier transmission or sharing confidential restriction information to third or fourth party providers? So remember that if they're like storing the information which is critical to us or which is important, that could be important. Plus the country, like which country they belong to. Because remember, if it is an overseas or a cross-border thing, then these privacy laws could become an issue for us. Next consideration I would like to take into place is this a new or existing supplier not assessed or more than 2 years ago? For example, if you're engaging with a supplier and we do it regularly in my organization, that the risk assessment, the assessment of the contractual obligations must be done at least once a year. So over here, if it is more than 2 years, and especially what I've seen in my experience, that if the supplier is like of a low budget supplier or from the financial perspective, normally like the volume is not very high. So those kinds of suppliers are normally tend to be ignored, or right, and the annual reviews are not performed very regularly. So that needs to be understood and that needs to be considered. So it's very important that we keep that thing in place. Then the next point to consider is the supplier involved in the build, change, or decommission of a system, network, or physical building. Remember, the build concept or the decommission could be a very challenge, and from the information security, especially the change and the decommission are very critical to consider. And in simple words, we should make sure that they have a proper process or a methodology on which they are decommissioning the system or infrastructure or a physical location, and same with the change management concept. Then the next point, similar to the previous two, that in the past 2 years we should always try to identify about the security incidents. If there's any major security incident which has happened, then we need to be concerned that probably the supplier's information security arrangements or cyber security arrangements are not appropriate and something needs to be done about it. So then we need to, so that's the best practice. Let's always try to have a shorter engagement with them rather than going for a long-term engagement, because then the breaking of the engagement might be a challenge or might result in some issues or financial penalties. Then this does the supplier comply with a framework such as ISO 27001 or something? So again, as we have said that if they are like within that framework, then definitely that really helps and increases our confidence. So that's these are the like bare minimum considerations we should take into our decision that whether we should be engaging with the supplier or we should still continue with working with that supplier. Then going to the next point is resilience. That is risk, ability to continue critical operations during periods of business disruption caused by suppliers. This is something very serious, and even in my organization, in my experience, I've seen that there are many at times, again, especially with the suppliers with a low volume or they're not critical. Even if they're critical, this BCP concept is like normally ignored or not considered very seriously. So remember, in this current world, where the scenario and the ever-changing world, this has become so important that this BCP concept is covered and is properly understood and reviewed before the supplier is engaged. So the considerations I would take in this resilience of the business continuity is that are the goods or services provided by supplier critical to the business? Yes. Then, because we should have our own risk assessment, and if we find that our products are critical, then we must make sure that the business continuity or the process or loss of disruption with the supplier is properly arranged, or supplier itself has a proper BCP and they properly test it. So there should be a concept of testing the concept, and we should be allowed at least to review the things, or review the test things, and understand are they fit for the purpose or not. So the next question, which is similar to that, is this a sole supplier or are there alternative supply options? If there is an alternate supply option, would the transition process to alternative supply option require significant resource and time? So this is another question that for some reason, right, if you want, or maybe one of the reasons is that you realize that the BCP or the DRP is not appropriately designed, the resilience is not properly designed for a supplier, then you might need to go for another supplier. But then the challenge is that transition to another supplier could be an issue by itself. So that's something we need to consider before engaging with any supplier. That then what would happen if we disengage with the supplier in the next year or two, right? And the last point, which is normally similar to others, but again, I always keep my benchmark as last 2 years. And that's the practice I always encourage in my organization also. That keep monitoring the KPIs and the performance, and for example, and especially the incidents. So maybe there are some incidents which they don't share with you directly, but you have to keep your eyes open and see the news or the media, and if we feel that there has been some significant damage or issues, then we need to consider not to engage with the supplier. Correct? Now, going down to the next point, which is anti-bribery or anti-corruption. So in this, the risk is that a supplier engage in bribery or corruption, impacting reputation, resulting in breach of bribery and corruption laws within your space or within your country. Right. So the first point I always say that if I've given this link on my slide, that is a traceinternational.org, where you should always try to find out the country which in which the supplier is residing, or the services in which they are engaged, probably with some other clients also. Are they engaged with any like high risk countries? So normally the rule of thumb is if the score is above 55, then those countries are like regarded as high risk, and then we should be more serious about it. We should consider all the aspects, or maybe get some independent review on that supplier before engaging with them, right? The next consideration I would say, will the supplier interact with intermediaries, government or customer officials, or other third parties as part of the process of providing the good or services? So remember, if it is a supplier or entity linked with any political exposed persons, or head by any political people, there is a potential of corruption and bribery, especially with countries where the risk score is above 55. So that is something we need to understand and make sure that those elements are not present before engaging with the supplier. Another thing to consider, which might minimize this threat of anti-bribery and other issues, is the supplier certified under ISO 37001, or does it have a governance process to identify, manage, and respond to bribery and corruption? So maybe either of the two. Ideal scenario, the certification does definitely helps. It definitely increases the confidence. But having said so, we need to make sure that if they're also engaged in and developing the process, and they have a system to identify fraud and assurance and everything, that those are like transparencies there and everything, then definitely those things needs to be considered. So has the supplier experienced any fraud, bribery, or corruption in the past 2 to 5 years? So I always say that maybe in this scenario, the reason I put 5 years, that 2 years might be a little bit shorter to identify such cases, because in case if there's something, you may not find out 2 years, but if again we need to keep our eyes open and in the media and everything and see if there is anything like that similar to that, then we need to again reconsider our contractual obligations with the supplier. Now going to the next point, which is fraud, which is similar to it, but again some additional points to put in. So this is, there are some like red flags. I always use red flags, that keeping the transactions transparent with the supplier is very important. So if you realize that there are some upfront payments or billing procedures which are unusual, or in, or if the supplier is reluctant to provide information, or maybe they are like providing invoices or documents which has like either delayed or has multiple mistakes, or maybe they are like avoiding you to tell their clients list, or they are not declaring on which country they are actually engaged with besides us, or maybe they are offering too many prizes and gifts, or maybe lots of incentives, then it's just a red flag. It's not necessary that they are engaged in fraudulent activities, but it's always a red flag which needs to be considered, which needs to be like at least explored and see if there is any such thing. And again, I've given you that transparency.org website, that again, if the score is 50 of that particular country in which this supplier is either engaged with or residing, then again, it's a high risk thing. And then we need to go through all possible checks and balances before that supplier is engaged. So these are the like bribery and fraud considerations which we must take into consideration before engaging the supplier. Now moving to point number 7, that is labor practice. Again, these are some of my experience with life, that first of all, the first consideration is that is the product manufactured, assembled, or does any parts come from a higher human rights risk country? So again, I've given you this website of fundforpeace.org, where you can find the index countries, the list of countries which are fragile, or do not meet human rights issues. So that is something which must be considered, because if your country is like very strong in human rights, and supplier in which you are engaging with is like in those countries where human rights are not considered seriously, then we might fall into trouble and everything. So what are the other checks we can consider? That does the supplier participate in human rights related initiatives such as Responsible Business Alliance, Joint Audit Corporation, and Nations Global Compact? So I've given the links for all of these things, which gives you good knowledge and information that how the participation of in these forums or in these organizations helps protect the workers of the human rights. So even if your supplier is engaged in either one of them also, that gives you some assurance that they are serious about the human rights and they take care of the people. Plus another check which I see which is really good, that's does the supplier website publicly share its human rights policy, or a supplier code of conduct which ensure human rights are respected in the supply chain. So either you visit their website and see if they have mentioned such thing, or if they have not, then maybe we can ask them that they have some kind of a code of conduct which is like used within the organization, which is signed by the team or the people who are working for them, right? So so that is something. Or again, watch out for the media and everything, because there are at times there are news which in the local channels could tell you a lot of things about it. So these are the things we must consider. Again, the last point, keep yourself open, start looking at things. If something has again happened in the past 2 years regarding that supplier, then it's a red flag for us to consider whether we should be engaging with the supplier or continue to be engaged with that supplier. So this is another important consideration we must take into thing, because the risk is that if the supplier is not complying with global or local human rights and standards, then we could end up in trouble. The next point, point number 8, moving to, is the health and safety. So again, the supplier is, if the supplier fails to meet the health and safety, then again we can end up in some kind of a penalty or a risk, or a risk to humans working for the team, working for the supplier. So again, the first point to consider: would the goods or services provided by the supplier have the potential to expose employees, contractors, visitors, or members of public to a potentially critically health, safety, and workplace environment incident? Right? So we need to understand what kind of goods and services they are engaged with. For example, if they are physical contractors working on development of or constructions, or moving physical buildings, or physical properties here and there, or items, or heavy items, or something like that. So, destruction of property, or building of property, or engagements of heavy equipment, then all these things becomes very critical for us. Again, has the supplier had any health and safety incidents within the past 2 years? So again, these things needs to be considered. These things needs to be serious. That again, if even if the incidents, what are they doing to resolve it? Like, how did they manage that individual, if which suffered some issues? What kind of protective measures they are giving them? Are they wearing the proper kit and when they're in the field working, the gloves and the masks and the helmets or any protective gear? Are they wearing it properly? So that's something which we need to consider. So maybe we can visit the site, or maybe we can ask them that are they in compliance with any best practices. So again, remember that there are requirements like AS 4801 or ISO 14001, which actually helps us to be, if they are certified with this, there's nothing like it. Or maybe you can have some your internal regulators certification, that are they certified with the country's regulators in the space of health, safety, and work environment. And plus the same point that again, if we find out they have been fined for some reasons or some issues related to health and safety in the last 2 years, then we need to make sure that those things are taken into consideration. Now moving to point number 9, environmental practice. Again, in this, the supplier's failure to meet environmental standards or laws could create an issue. The first consideration here which is very important in this scenario, is this: will the supplier is the supplier is providing electronics, electrical products, support management of networks of property, installation or maintenance or disposal of infrastructure? So again, just I mentioned for the health, same concerns goes for the environmental issues, that if your suppliers engage with such kind of products, then from the supplier, from the environmental safety also, these things needs to be considered. So plus again, is the supplier has accredited environmental management system certification, which I mentioned, like ISO 14001, or is the supplier member of Electronics Industry Citizen Coalition? So these things needs to be consideration. That so these certifications or these membership actually gives us some assurance again that the supplier is definitely taking care of environmental issues or risks and the health and safety issues, right? Plus, there is a CSR report which is published. Maybe those reports or sustainability report which help us to understand that whether supplier is actually is in compliance with those issues, and whatever risks they are facing, or they are transparent around it, then they share with the thing, and what are they doing to minimize the impact on the environment. So these reports are really helpful, and we should ask them if these reports they haven't ever been engaged in such kind of reviews or anything like that. The last point, the point number 10, which is related to trade controls, that is, risk suppliers not complying with trade controls in connection with delivery of good and service. So remember that this is also important, that either it's a physical item or a software or a soft item, and especially if they are moving across borders, then border controls and trade controls of that particular country needs to be considered. So these are the things important. The second consideration is to that does the supplier have a formal import-export control program in place? So this is something which can give us an assurance that are they addressing all the export control regulations or not. So for that, I've given you that list. Like for my country, like Australia, we have a website through which we can see what are the sanctions and what are the laws around that. Then again, from US Department of Treasury website, list down all this information, and from the EU, you can also see all those details. So these things must be considered before engaging the supplier, especially the suppliers like located in some other country or dealing with some sensitive goods or information around that. So these are very important things to consider, and this is based which I'm sharing with you. That's based on my experience and so far. So these are the 10 areas which we just discussed. So going back again on my first focus slide. So the 10 areas which I discussed is like operational, commercial, information security, resilience, anti-bribery and anti-corruption, fraud, labor practice, health and safety, environmental practice, and trade controls. So I hope this will add some value in your understanding and in your daily practices. And so besides your proper risk management supply governance program, which normally I've seen in good in mature organizations established, but these are some additional points which must be added in your reviews, in your audit, or before engaging the supplier. These items must be considered at least, right? So that's it. That's all from my side. Now I'm open for any questions. So let me know if you guys have any questions, any things which needs further explanation, or maybe something which I can add more value based on my experience that how do we actually do it in real world? How do we practice such things? Feel free to ask the questions. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.